This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi. Welcome to Hubwonk, a podcast of Pioneer Institute, a think tank in Boston. Unfolding in real time is the quadrennial process of choosing our next American president. While Article 2, Section 1 of our Constitution outlines the procedures for electing the president, it leaves out the specifics of how candidates should be nominated. In a process steeped in history, reform, and the vibrant energy of democracy, it has been the work of parties themselves to shape the delicate balance among constituent voters, political professionals, and events of the day to determine the nominee. This year, the Democrat Party must also address their members' concerns that their presumptive nominee, President Biden, may not have the ability to sustain a successful campaign, leaving many to consider late-stage options for alternate nominees. How did our current primary system evolve? Who governs primary rules in states and at conventions? And who has the power to change the nominee as election day approaches? My guest today is the Keenan Sahin Distinguished Professor of Political Science at MIT, Professor Charles Stewart III, who is the founding director of the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. Professor Stewart's work focuses on the historical developments of committees, origins of partisan polarization, and Senate elections. He will explain how our modern primary process has evolved, who determines and enforces primary rules, and what choices are available when nominees are either unwilling or unable to successfully campaign for president. When I return, I'll be joined by Director of the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, Professor Charles Stewart III. Okay, we're back. This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi, and I'm now pleased to be joined by the Keenan Sahin Distinguished Professor of Political Science at MIT, Professor Charles Stewart III. Welcome back to Hubwonk, Professor Stewart.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's good to have you back. It was nearly 4 years ago when you last joined me. You helped us sort out the complexity of trying to run a presidential election during a pandemic. We'll say it turned out okay, I suppose. Today, we're going to talk about the election before us. We've got a primary process. I suppose the votes are in, but we're recording at a time during the Republican convention in Milwaukee and soon Democratic convention in Chicago. We're going to pick the nominees for president for the 2024 presidential election. For the benefit of our listeners, I want to break down the process of primaries. I also want to address the fact that whereas both candidates are clear, both parties and many members within those parties have concerns either that because of age or infirmity of candidates, or we're recording shortly after the attempted assassination of one of the candidates, former President Donald Trump. Events of the day can intervene in unforeseen and unpredictable ways. So we want to understand how the process is supposed to work, but also what can be done mid-race to adapt to changing events. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start simple. Let's talk about presidential primaries. Who defines how primaries work, both at the federal or at the state level? Where is that set up?
Well, so you asked us to start simple, and in some ways, this is among the most complicated things to answer about. I mean, the simplest way to start is just by pointing out that primaries of all sorts, but especially presidential primaries, are owned by the parties. And so in a fundamental way, the parties create the broad, let's say, guardrails around which they govern how the process will happen. But even then, the parties themselves are complex because you have the national parties and then you have the state parties. And we can get into the details about that. But the national parties set out the broad parameters of, say, what the season is for holding the primaries, what the rules are about binding or not binding delegates, how many delegates, allocation of delegates, things like that. And the national parties could constrain the state parties in the decisions that the state parties are allowed to make. For instance, the national parties can leave it up to the state parties in how they allocate delegates, or they can be very prescriptive about how they can do that. And the Democrats and Republicans are different in that regard. At the same time, there's the states, and the states actually run the primaries. Now, there are still a few states that have caucuses, and there the parties are entirely in charge. But if you want to run a primary, in almost all cases, it's going to be the state that runs the primary, and the state has a certain practical um, kind of influence on this. If and a good example is New Hampshire, right? New Hampshire has this law which states it has to be the first primary in the nation. The Democrats a while back said no, South Carolina is going to be the first primary in the nation. How is that resolved? Well, New Hampshire held a primary, first one in the nation. Democrats said, okay, fine, but you're not going to elect any delegates to our convention at this, and so it kind of created this kind of confusion about what was going on in New Hampshire in January, right? So you have this dance, and there are other examples where the state governments and the national parties or the state parties kind of play a game of chicken around who's actually going to run things and how it's going to operate. Nonetheless, at the end of the day, it's really the parties who are in charge, not the states or even the federal government, certainly, in determining how what the rules are going to be ultimately.
So we have 50 states. It's a whole array of different systems in charge there. I say individual state parties. I would say, again, I don't want to speak for all primary voters in this great country, but I'd say in general, we get the sense that individual party members go out on primary day and vote. We count up the votes, and the winner, the one with the most votes, either gets all or a proportionate share of the state's delegates. Has it always been this way? And if not, what came before? How old is what we consider normal? How did we get here?
Yeah, the system we have right now, I would say, that we can demarcate history in 1972. And it's really 72 forward. And 72 came about in reaction to the 68 Democratic Convention. And the reforms, the changes that happened around there focused on the Democratic Convention, but the Republicans of that era pretty much came along. So let's say 68 and before, there was a mixture of methods for choosing delegates to the conventions. The conventions were seen really as the actors in making the choices. And there had been, even in the 20th century, going into the convention, not quite knowing who was going to be the nominee. So some states had caucuses. Other states, like New Hampshire, have been holding a primary for a century, right? So you had a kind of a mix before 72.
So we have a 50,
yeah, go ahead.
So just curious. We have a 50-year sort of convention as in a standard we've become used to. Was it perceived, and you're the expert, so I'm asking this candidly, was it, let's say, a move from where, in the olden days, I suppose, conventions served to determine who the nominee would be, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems that conventions now are merely sort of rah-rah sessions where we just, balloons fall out of the ceiling and everybody cheers. So they seem ceremonial, if you will. And again, I'm not putting words in your mouth. You tell me if I'm wrong. Why did we go from where we determine the candidate at a convention with, let's say, party professionals, and now
right? I think it's more ceremonial than not. Although it's always been the case, and certainly for the past century and a half, that incumbent presidents have basically been the most important player in their party. And so it was pretty much all the time, although like Grant, there are exceptions like President Grant, where party elders kind of pushed Grant out as an incumbent. So it was celebratory, like when Eisenhower was renominated, or those circumstances. But really, before 68, and certainly moving back further in time in the 20th century into the 19th century, the parties could be thought about really as kind of holding companies of 50 state parties some of which were run according to kind of quasi-open um, rules, but others were very much what we would imagine to be kind of, kind of inside baseball, smoke-filled rooms, sorts of kind of a club. And it's not too far from reality to say in many of those states, Illinois was the most famous with Mayor Daley, Richard Daley, the mayor of Chicago, but the party boss of the entire state, right? Really could deliver delegates, could deliver votes on election day. And so it really was a mostly kind of 50 bull mooses in a room, bringing their delegates, and they could pledge their entire delegation or some of their delegation if, so that was one thing. There was a revolt publicly and certainly within the Democratic Party after in the '68 convention, which your listeners will know, even if they weren't alive at the time, was a disaster in Chicago.
Yeah.
Not only riots in the streets, but riots actually made it onto the floor of the convention. And Hubert Humphrey was nominated despite the fact that he really didn't run in primaries. And that's why I mentioned the McGovern-Fraser Commission that really changed the rules of the Democratic Party to make it so that delegates would be chosen mostly by primaries, and that they would be required to vote for, the candidate that had won that primary or that they were associated with, certainly on the first ballot.
So,
And so it's kind of celebratory now, but it still is. Well, it's mostly more celebratory, but potentially could be, could make a decision.
well, that sets up my next question perfectly, which is to say, okay, we now have our what we consider individual state, very sort of traditional elections. We count votes and we figure out, who won. Those delegates have their marching orders, right? The party members in their state have spoken, and they have to go to the convention with specific orders. They're committed to that candidate. What I want to ask you is, again, in the, let's say, modern times, the last 50 years, does that resolve things? It seems like, we knew President Trump or former President Trump would get the nomination, it seems, and incumbent President Biden would. But have there been contested elections? And if one conventions, and if one were to be, what does that look like if there isn't a clear winner walking into the convention?
Well, are there contested conventions? There haven't been, and certainly there have been instances where the kind of the second place candidate has wanted to make it a contested election. And those were cases where the party was closely divided. And the famous cases were Ronald Reagan in 1976, Ted Kennedy in 1980 in the Democratic primary. And then even in 2016, there were efforts to derail Donald Trump's nomination and kind of make the primary really the decider, and to throw it open, a so-called brokered convention. It turns out, though, that in this 50-year period, we've gone into both major party conventions with somebody having a majority of delegates. And that's really hard to dislodge, even in a situation as we find ourselves in right now, or even, in 76 or 80 cases where the second place candidate had a good argument to make that they would be the better candidate. But once you've chosen people who are really loyal to the front runner, also, the primary rules are such that kind of the one who gets the most votes in states kind of gets a bonus. And that's especially true in the Republican Party, but also true in the Democratic Party. So, the front runner comes in with a cushion, even if their support begins to kind of get soft. They're going to have a big cushion. And I'm sure we'll talk about Joe Biden in particular, but he's going to come in with 90% of the delegates.
Yes,
so he could lose almost half of his delegates and still get the nomination.
So indeed, so he has a comfortable lead, and as you mentioned, this isn't a case where we have a second place person who's sort of chomping at the bit, trying to say, okay, I might be better. We have really, I don't know who second place would be really, but let's unpack that a little further. You talked about these delegates going to the convention. They've been committed. I've read something, again, in research and preparing for this conversation, that they're bound in good conscience to vote for the person who they was elected in their state. Okay, there's a lot of wiggle room in good conscience, because some would argue, again, I'm not making any normative judgments, but some might say we had no idea President Biden was aging the way he is until, let's say, the debate or recent gaffes. Were we to have known that, we would have perhaps voted differently in our individual primaries. Now that we do know it, me as a delegate, I'm going to the convention in Chicago. Do I have any prerogative? I might like the guy, but conventions and primaries and parties are for winning elections. If I don't think my guy can do it, what prerogative do I have?
Yeah, well, here's where the two parties are different again. And as you said, we're really talking about Biden, but it should be said there's something sometimes called the robot rule. And the robot rules are, basically bind a delegate to their person, kind of stand by my man or woman type of rule that usually binds that pledged delegate to vote for their candidate on their first ballot. And in fact, like the Democratic Party rules, actually, no, I'm sorry, the Republican Party rules allow delegates to be replaced on the fly if they vote for the wrong person, or not for those votes not to be recognized. And so the Republicans still have a strong version of the robot rule. The Democrats have a weak version of the robot rule, as you just mentioned, which is that their delegates are required to vote in good conscience to reflect the sentiments of those who elected them. But we have to recognize that the delegates at the state level or the congressional district level, however the states allocate them, are identified by the political parties, or I'm rather the candidates, as people who are loyal to those candidates. And so I won't say that the Biden delegates are like the Stepford wives, but in that sense. But you don't get to be a Biden delegate unless you're willing really to go to Matt for Joe. And I think it's kind of really wishful thinking to imagine that there's going to be really kind of a come to Jesus moment in the Democratic convention unless Biden himself instructs his delegates not to vote for him and to find somebody else.
So accepting that eventuality, if Biden doesn't say, I'm sorry, guys, I'm going to pass the baton, if he wants a nomination, there's almost no choice, conscience or otherwise, for delegates to change horses this late in the race.
Oh yeah, no, they got their guy. Got their guy.
Right. Okay. So we talked about sort of primaries. We're leading up to conventions. What about, okay, we have a nomination, but current events happen. I'm going to, again, we keep talking about President Biden, but the horrible event that happened past weekend, assassination attempt. Look, these guys are both 178, 181. Actuarial tables say it could be a heart attack. Where is it that, let's say, parties and process, and we're still not at election day, were something terrible to happen, either they become incapacitated or die, what happens, let's say, as we approach election day? Where does the party, where do delegates, are these all active participants until the election day, or something else happens if it happens after the convention?
Yeah, it kind of depends on how close you are to election day, and this is where kind of the I won't call it loosey goosey, but kind of the ambiguous nomination role of the parties comes up against our Constitution, quite frankly, and national laws. I mean, Congress has mandated. So we're coming back to our discussion 4 years ago about voting during the pandemic. And what I was saying 4 years ago, I don't know if I said it on this broad podcast, But even if the zombies are in the street and the asteroids are raining down on us on election day, we're going to have an election. We have no choice, right? And so even if one of the presidential candidates gets hit by a bus the day before the election, we're going to have the election the next day. And the only person for that party on the ballot will be that person, right? So we can't, like most of the rest of the Democratic world, we couldn't postpone. We don't have any of that flexibility. And that's where I think a lot of the ambiguities and the chaos would emerge. Because now, if you're really close to, I mean, if you're kind of far from the election, like if it were to happen like the week after the conventions, there would be time for the national committees have mechanisms for naming replacements for their nominees. And the best historical example was in 1972 when the Democrats had to replace their vice presidential nominee. And it was the DNC that replaced them under the party rules. And the party rules have ways of replacing nominees. But if the ballots have been printed and if people are already voting, then you're left with a position of people voting for somebody who is incapacitated or is no longer alive, and then what to do. I think there we're up against norms and what the laws are in the states about what electors can do. Yeah, so I'll stop there. I mean, there's details that we can dig into, but that's I'll stop for a moment right there.
Well, let's not have such a grim possibility, scenario play out. Let's just talk about, there's certainly a healthy movement to try to persuade President Biden to step aside and perhaps let someone, let's say, more viable or more electable take his place. There's a lot of question about money. A lot of people give money to the actual president himself. This is not super PACs or political committees. These are, the president himself has a war chest. I think all in is something like $240 million. That's people writing checks to him or his reelection. What happens to those monies were a leading candidate to say, I'm sorry, I'm going to, retire at the end of my term? Where does that go?
Yeah, it kind of depends. I mean, it depends on when they bow out. If they are not the nominee, like so let's just focus, because we know what we're talking about. Let's focus on Joe Biden. If he woke up this morning and says, "Okay, I'm out,"
right?
He's not the nominee. He would have to give the money back, unless the campaign committee is the Biden-Harris. And so Kamala Harris would inherit that money. So it makes a difference here that we have a joint committee of a presidential and a vice presidential candidate together. And so that would allow Harris to continue. But if the party doesn't nominate her, then that's a problem. The other thing to consider is that, let's say in a couple of weeks, and keep in mind the Democrats look like they're moving forward on their plan to do a virtual roll call in the next week or two. So Biden may be the formal nominee sooner than the convention. Once he's nominated, then those funds, it's no longer a nomination fund, it's a general election fund. And the general, again, if it's Kamala Harris who ends up replacing him, then that's one thing. But if it's not, then there are limits on what that committee can do with those funds. He could only give $2,000 to the other candidate, to Buttigieg or whoever becomes the nominee. The rest of the money would have to go to like a super PAC. He could create a leadership PAC that could pour money into the election in uncoordinated, in theory, but not kind of directly part of the campaign, and the new nominee would need to start fundraising on their own. We hear reports that there's a bunch of wealthy donors sitting on $90 million, and maybe they would disgorge that 90 million for Mayor Pete or whoever. But it would be kind of starting from a cold start for anybody else, especially if it's not Kamala Harris.
Yeah, it seems like the party would have to be rather desperate. So to be clear, I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. If Biden steps aside and the convention chooses someone, if it's Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, she would be entitled to the money that's been raised.
That's my understanding and listening to the election lawyers.
If it's anyone else, whereas they as candidates or former candidates, can't use it, because they're not candidates, they could create their own super PAC. Why wouldn't the money that was given, and again, we know from campaign finance laws that, every one of those donations is documented somewhere. Why don't they have to give it back? And in a sense, why is it now the prerogative of the candidate who's no longer the candidate to choose where that money goes? Wouldn't it have to be given back to the donor?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I don't know why, but from everything I've read from the election lawyers, that they make this distinction about before and after nomination, and that it belongs. I mean, it now belongs to the committee. Committee could give it back for sure, but my suspicion would be that it would be rolled into some sort of political operation in support of the nominee.
All right. So our conversation is talking about the nomination getting up to the election. I don't want to bring up a sore subject, but of course now November 5th, as you say, is coming no matter what. Zombies, asteroids, it's coming. Get ready. So someone's going to get elected. But we had, again, I don't want to bring up a sore topic, but in 2020, a lot of disagreement about the prerogatives then when we're in, again, now this is governed by statutory law. This is no longer the prerogative of parties. This is the real thing. It's a real election. Individual states, as we know, it's not people that elect presidents, it's states that elect presidents. Each of those states send electors that have been determined by that state's constitutional obligation to send those electors. We had a lot of disagreement. Maybe it wasn't legitimate disagreement, but some disagreement in 2020 how those electors must then ultimately go in and be counted for the election. Is there any disagreement, again, with the wisdom of reflection of 4 years, any ambiguity or any changes in the law that have sort of shored up our system such that we're not going to have any more debate as to prerogatives of actual electors, not delegates? These are electors.
Right, exactly. Well, debate, no, there's always going to be debate. Actual actions, yes, we're in a better situation now than we were 4 years ago, and that's because a couple of years ago, in a fit of bipartisanship, Congress passed and President Biden signed the Electoral Count Reform Act, which also had a Transition Act component to it as well, which also dealt with the kerfuffle over whether Biden could start his transition before the inauguration. The Electoral Count Act addresses many of the issues that arose in 2020. It starts by specifying that the vice president's role is purely ministerial. No decisions about who gets the count or anything like that. He's purely presiding over a counting of votes. It's harder to make a congressional challenge to votes. It can only be given for cause. And instead of one member from each chamber objecting, you need 1/5 of each chamber to object to the counting of any votes. States cannot change their method of election after election day. That's been settled, because you recall 4 years ago there were some attempts to get the state legislatures to elect electors, and that's been foreclosed. There are stricter deadlines for certifying elections, and there is now a provision if a candidate is unhappy with certification, or if there's any legal challenge to certification, you can impanel in that state a special, I believe it's a 3-judge court to rule on those challenges. So there's a belief among the legal community that this kind of covers most of the problems that arose and at least solves those problems. Well, there could be new problems in the future we haven't anticipated. There's also an argument that has been made that you can't bind a future Congress. And so that's why I say it's not going to cut off debate, right? There's still going to be people claiming, if they're unhappy, well, we can go into January 6th and or whatever the date will be, and we can overturn this election. But the black letter of the law is pretty clear to try to foreclose a lot of options.
There may be all new, different krakens to set loose this time.
There's always a new kraken.
So we're getting close to the end of our time together. I just want to ask sort of a meta question. I think sort of the sentiment bouncing around, particularly among Democratic circles, is sort of, look, Biden, is not the best candidate. We make the rules, we can break the rules. I want to get meta on you. It's like, if people believe that rules are just something we've created and therefore infinitely malleable, what is it about elections or just rules that sort of constrain our ability to change them on the fly? Isn't there something within us, maybe as Americans or maybe as human beings, where whatever the rules may be, you got to stick by them through the entire match? You can't change the rules of the game mid-stride. Is that real, or is that just my perception as sort of a conservative guy who doesn't like messing with the controls while you're still flying?
Yeah. Look, and it's something I teach my students, that the rule of law is a very strong principle in this country, and certainly it's been kind of bandied about over the last several years. But speaking about conservatives, go back to the founding, go back to Locke, go back to Montesquieu, go back to all those people, right? It justifies, the rule of law is really an important thing, and is really drilled into Americans. We're not quite Germans in that sense, right? We do see some flexibility, maybe the other places won't. But fairness in the United States is oftentimes judged in terms of following the rules, and then, to use sports metaphors, winning or losing based on everybody playing on the same playing field and knowing the rules ahead of the game. That's kind of the American way of doing it. If we were British, we might be a little more sophisticated or whatever, cosmopolitan about the use of rules, and might understand a bit more that that politics is about power, and that it's sometimes okay to bend the rules to get power. But that's really that's not the American way.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So you made reference to your students. I want to, before we close, I want to give an opportunity to plug your work at MIT with the Election Science and Data Center. What kind of work do you do, and can our listeners look it up and learn something, or is there some sort of repository of research and information about elections in general that they could access, let's say, online?
Oh, absolutely. Go to our website. We, like everyone else, have a website. Election Lab, one word, electionlab.mit.edu. And we do research ranging from the geeky to the publicly accessible. We write explainers. We write commentary about a number of things. We will be following the 2024 election very closely and be writing kind of geeky, number crunchy analyses about what's going on. We'll be following the election skeptics and trying to kind of debunk the weirder and crazier takes on the American election. So in any case, electionlab.mit.edu.
That's wonderful. Well, good. I promise I will be checking on that often in this crazy time of election. So I really appreciate your time, Professor Stewart. I hope our listeners have learned something, and I hope we have a safe, fair, and uncontested, God bless, election ahead of us in 2024. Thank you for your time, Professor Stewart.
Sure enough. Likewise, and this was fun. It's a lot of fun.
This has been another episode of Hubwonk. If you enjoyed today's show, there are several ways to support Hubwonk and Pioneer Institute. It would be easier for you and better for us if you subscribe to Hubwonk on your iTunes podcatcher. It would make it easier for others to find us if you offer a 5-star rating or a favorable review. We're, of course, grateful if you share Hubwonk with friends. If you have ideas or comments or suggestions for me about future episode topics, you're welcome to email me at hubwonk@pioneerinstitute.org. Please join me next week for a new episode of Hubwonk.